Today we are examining a profound psychological reality. When an empath chooses to leave, the narcissist's inner turmoil truly begins. To grasp this, we first need to understand the emotional system that connected them. The empath is typically highly sensitive, emotionally perceptive, and deeply responsive to others' needs. The narcissist, in contrast, relies intensely on outside validation to steady a fragile sense of self-worth. This interaction forms a strong yet unhealthy attachment. One continuously offers emotional energy, while the other continually takes it. In psychological language, the narcissist depends on what is commonly known as emotional supply. This supply goes beyond simple attention. It includes praise, admiration, and ongoing reassurance. The empath, motivated by compassion and a wish to heal, often becomes the main provider of that supply. They listen, they excuse, they internalize, they try to make sense of the behavior, and in doing so, they unknowingly calm the narcissist's inner instability. But eventually, a shift occurs. When the empath becomes aware of the imbalance, when they realize that love without mutual exchange turns into self-betrayal, they start to withdraw. And withdrawal in this situation is not harshness, it is awareness. And when the empath steps away, the narcissist goes through something significant: emotional deprivation. The reliable flow of affirmation suddenly stops. The reflection that once magnified their grand image disappears. Without that reflection, the narcissist is left facing an identity that feels shaky and divided. This is where the psychological torment begins. The narcissist's visible self-assurance often hides deep-seated insecurity. Much of their identity is built to avoid facing shame, feelings of inadequacy, and unresolved emotional pain. The empathy, unknowingly helped keep that structure intact. Their comfort and reassurance functioned like scaffolding around a delicate structure. When the empath exits, that support system falls apart. Internally, this may surface as anger, not necessarily because love is gone, but because dominance has slipped away. Control over praise, control over the story. The narcissist might try to reclaim power through manipulation, guilt tactics, or quickly forming new attachments. Yet these are survival strategies, not true remedies. And what deepens the mental distress is silence. When the empath stops responding, stops debating, justifying, or explaining, the narcissist loses emotional access. And for someone who depends on reaction, indifference feels devastating. Psychologically, this can lead to what might be described as identity destabilization. Without outside reinforcement, the constructed persona struggles to stay intact. Anxiety increases. Fixation can emerge. The narcissist may revisit past conversations, attempt hoovering behaviors, or search for new validation sources to dull the unease. Still, underneath it all lies something more profound: exposure. The empath's absence creates a reflection the narcissist cannot easily avoid. For the first time, there is no one absorbing projections, no one managing the emotional weight. The narcissist stands alone with their inner reality. And here lies the contradiction. What feels like psychological suffering can also be an opening. The discomfort of abandonment can become a gateway to self-awareness if one is willing to confront it. But real development demands responsibility. It requires recognizing the difference between domination and connection, between applause and genuine intimacy. And for the empath, choosing to leave is not about retaliation. It is about honoring self-worth. It is the understanding that empathy does not mean self-erasure. Emotional intelligence involves setting limits. Compassion requires wisdom. And here is the empowering truth within this psychological pattern. When you prioritize self-respect over self-sacrifice, you interrupt toxic cycles, you stop sustaining dysfunction, and you reclaim your emotional power. The narcissist's internal struggle after your departure is not yours to carry. It is the predictable result of reliance without mutual exchange. Ultimately, this pattern reveals a broader lesson about emotional growth. Bonds built on inequality cannot last. Healthy relationships require shared empathy, accountability, and emotional balance. When the empath walks away, the quiet holds immense strength. And not because it serves as punishment, but because it uncovers truth. It shows who is relying on whom. It clarifies who was consistently giving and who was consistently receiving. And above all, it demonstrates that emotional power is not always dramatic. At times, the most powerful message is simply walking away. And when you leave with understanding, you are not creating suffering, you are dissolving illusion. When the empath steps away, what collapses first is not the bond itself, but the unseen emotional framework that was supporting the narcissist's delicate self-image. In many of these relationships, the empath becomes the main stabilizer of emotional balance, providing reassurance, affirmation, and patience that calm insecurities the narcissist cannot consciously acknowledge. This steady stream of validation operates as an external brace for an identity that may appear confident outwardly, yet remains unstable beneath the surface. Because the narcissistic structure depends heavily on admiration and reaction from others. The empath's focus functions like psychological air. When that air is abruptly withdrawn, the narcissist does not simply feel grief. They experience disruption. The inner story of superiority starts to fracture without someone continuously mirroring it back. Self-doubt, once projected outward through criticism or dominance, begins to reverberate within. The removal of the empath's emotional effort reveals how much stability was borrowed instead of internally built. What may follow includes restlessness, repetitive rumination, attempts to regain authority, or a hurried search for another source of validation. These behaviors are not evidence of profound love, but signs of reliance on outside affirmation. The empath's exit breaks a cycle where one individual consistently absorbed emotional chaos, while the other avoided responsibility. In psychological language, this produces a withdrawal response. The nervous system, accustomed to constant reinforcement, reacts with tension and irritability when that reinforcement disappears. The narcissist may label this discomfort as betrayal or unfairness, but at its core, it is the unease of confronting unfiltered self-awareness. Without someone softening the consequences of their actions, they must face unresolved shame and unmet emotional needs alone. The empath's quiet becomes a reflection that cannot be reshaped. And within that reflection, the carefully preserved illusion of control begins to disintegrate. And as distance grows, the psychological effects deepen because the narcissist is pushed into a condition long avoided, emotional solitude without observers. Much of their behavioral pattern centers on preserving a carefully designed image that secures admiration and shields vulnerability from exposure. The empath once acted as both audience and supporter of that image, frequently defending, explaining, or minimizing harmful actions in the name of compassion. When that protective layer vanishes, the narcissist loses not only validation, but also control of the narrative. This erosion of control may trigger intensified defensiveness, shifting blame, or efforts to reconstruct history in order to protect self-esteem. Yet beneath these outward reactions exists a more profound disruption, a confrontation with internal emptiness. Without ongoing feedback confirming their significance, the narcissist may sense a void that is challenging to define and even harder to endure. This emptiness is not mere loneliness. It reflects the absence of a cohesive and stable identity capable of existing without constant approval. In this stage, emotional instability often becomes increasingly apparent. Irritation, impulsivity, rash choices, or sudden new connections may arise as attempts to numb internal discomfort. The empath's absence eliminates the familiar outlet for projection, meaning there is no longer someone available to absorb blame or emotional intensity. Consequently, buried feelings such as inadequacy or shame may surface in uneven and fragmented ways. The narcissist might swing between inflated confidence and deep discouragement, craving reassurance while resisting accountability. The silence that remains becomes psychologically unsettling because it cannot be controlled, debated, or minimized. Indifference especially challenges the expectation of being central within another person's emotional world. Facing irrelevance can feel deeply destabilizing. Yet within that instability lies a possibility, though rarely accepted, for reflection. The very discomfort that feels like psychological anguish could become an opening to cultivate internal balance and genuine self-awareness. Whether transformation happens depends on the willingness to endure it and vulnerability instead of avoiding it through repeated attempts at control. As time passes, the psychological impact of the empath's departure moves from immediate emotional upheaval to a deeper and more sustained inner reckoning. At first, the narcissist may try to regain balance through denial, distraction, new romantic interests, or amplified self-promotion, believing that fresh admiration will reproduce the stabilizing influence once offered by the empath. However, these replacements often lack the emotional depth that made the original bond so regulating. The empath did not simply offer compliments. They offered presence, tolerance, and genuine emotional investment. Without that level of connection, outside praise can feel empty and short-lived, demanding continuous renewal. This fuels a cycle of pursuit without fulfillment, where each new wave of attention briefly comforts but never resolves the underlying instability. The discomfort lingers because the core issue was never just losing a person, but losing a reflective anchor that concealed unresolved insecurity. And as these external coping strategies begin to lose their effect, a quieter yet more profound tension may surface. The realization that the empath's exit was a consequence rather than random rejection. Even if this awareness remains mostly beneath consciousness, it can create internal conflict. On one side, the self-image insists on superiority and innocence. On the other, reality hints that personal behavior contributed to the separation. This clash can manifest as irritability, defensiveness, or a rigid resistance to vulnerability. Yet it may also open brief moments of insight when the narcissist recognizes the recurring pattern that led to disconnection. The empath's absence becomes a silent form of feedback, revealing how reliance on control weakens authentic intimacy. In this space, the psychological torment is less explosive and more enduring, a persistent sense that something significant was lost. Whether this awareness transforms into growth depends on the ability to endure shame without turning it into hostility. If response, ability is accepted, the pain can initiate change. If denied, the same cycle simply repeats with someone new, leaving the inner void untouched. And over time, the most lasting element of this internal struggle is not the dramatic outburst or desperate search for substitution, but the quiet self-confrontation that follows repeated relational breakdowns. When the empath leaves and maintains that boundary, the permanence challenges the narcissist's long-standing belief that relationships can always be restored through charm, persuasion, or pressure. The failure to regain control introduces an unfamiliar truth. Boundaries exist, and they are not always negotiable. This awareness can feel threatening because it dismantles the illusion of total influence that once shielded against helplessness. Without the empath's engagement, there is no emotional leverage to use, no predictable script to replay. What remains is the understanding that genuine connection depends on reciprocity, not dominance. For someone accustomed to shifting blame outward, this recognition can create ongoing internal strain. They may alternate between rationalizing their behavior and reluctantly admitting that their relational patterns played a role in the outcome. And at this stage, the psychological suffering is defined less by anger and more by emptiness and repetition. Familiar dynamics may reappear in new relationships, exposing that the issue was not a partner's sensitivity, but the inability to maintain shared empathy. Each unsuccessful effort to recreate the former dynamic reinforces a difficult realization. True intimacy requires vulnerability, accountability, and emotional self-regulation. Without cultivating these qualities internally, external admiration will never be enough. The empath's departure becomes a symbolic crossroads, marking the moment emotional dependency was uncovered. If defensive Venus prevails, superficial bonds continue alongside chronic dissatisfaction. If discomfort is allowed to evolve into reflection, meaningful psychological change becomes possible. Such growth would require understanding that real strength lies not in control, but in stability without constant validation. The silence the empath leaves behind can either fortify defenses or soften them. The result depends on whether unmet needs are faced honestly or continually hidden behind grandiosity.